Welcome to the last meeting of our lecture series, Times of Festival. I'm Eckhard Marchand, the organizer of the series. At the end of this series, I should like to look briefly back over the previous 7 lectures. And if you have missed any of them, 4 of them at least have been recorded and can be watched via the link on our homepage, where you soon also be able to revisit today's talk. We started with, if we could have the first slide, please. Thank you. We started with a musicological presentation by Michael Fendt, who analyzed the changing musical forms of 3 successive festivals in relation to their relevant political connotations. After this 3-part overture that visited Italy, France, and Germany over 5 centuries, Unvar Rustum from Princeton University immediately widened our geographical horizon by looking at 18th century Ottoman architecture and how ceremonial traditions there stimulated new types of buildings and architectural forms designed to signal and assert the presence of the ruler. This was one of 3 papers of non-European topics, the 3rd of which we are going to hear today. A 4th was planned, but sadly that didn't materialize. The autumn term ended with a presentation delivered by Nerida Newbegin early in the morning from Sydney, looking at the Florentine Festa di San Giovanni and the use, development, and development of images in its processions. Next slide, please. Nerida's paper started a sub-series on Italian Renaissance festivals that were discussed from the points of view of the literary historian Nerida, musicologist Reinhard Strom, and the social cultural historian Matteo Cassini, who also, I think, attended almost all of our lectures in this series. Thank you very much, Matteo. One aspect that came to the fore in all these 3 papers was the increasing appropriation and transformation of religious festivals by worldly powers, an issue that I believe also relates to today's Indian topic. When I devised the series, the choice of topic was guided by my own research interests on ephemeral sculpture and by the central role festivals and ceremonial life played in A. Warburg's work. As Burckhardt before him, Warburg believed in the generative powers of festivals and festive life that stimulated artists to draw on earlier expressive formula, or enabling these to reassert themselves. This notion was directly revisited by UCL's anthropologists Susanne Küchler in relation to rise of life and temporal objects related to this that she had studied over several years on the island of Melanesia in Papua New Guinea. One of the staggering insights of this material was how there the most complex rituals and belief systems had evolved over a surprisingly short span of time. Next slide, please. This term started last week with François Kiviget's paper on the Huguenot potter, scientist, and author Bernard Palissy and his earthenware. And François is also one of our constant participants. And that earthenware that had a clear place in the festivities of the French court. Moving on from casts of dead animals that are frozen in time and ready to gain life once Palissy's dishes are filled with water and passed around for hand washing, moving on from these objects, courtly objects, to the fate of ephemeral objects in a much more diverse environment, I'm now turning to today's lecture and its speaker. Tapati Guha-Thakurta is honorary professor of history and former director of the Center for Studies studies in social sciences, Calcutta. She trained at Presidency College and Calcutta University and completed her formal studies with a PhD at Oxford University. Professor Guha-Thakurta is a cultural historian and has worked on themes such as art, nationalism, and modernity, the institutional practices and political locations of art history and archaeologists, and on the history and perception of monuments and museum objects, which I believe is definitely an ongoing research interest in her work. Particularly relevant for our topic today is her work on popular urban visual culture of modern and contemporary India. Tapati has published 3 major books: The Making of New Indian Art, Artists, Aesthetics, and Nationalism in Bengal, published in 2004. Monuments, Objects, Histories, Institutions of Art in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, published also in 2004. And in the name, the
first book is 1992.
Yes, sorry, I muddled my own notes. And in the name of the goddess, the Durga Pujas of contemporary Calcutta, published in 2015, and today's paper is relating to that. Thank you very much, Tapati, for staying up very late to join us here with your paper. Professor Guha-Thakurta will speak about Residues and Reuse, a festival and its afterlife in an Indian metropolis. Thank you, and over to you.
Okay. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Eckhart. I am deeply honored to be part of this lecture series of the Warburg Institute. And it's a bit of a daunting experience to bring my work on the festival into the circle of scholarship and erudition, particularly on Renaissance Europe and its tradition of festivals. But I took it on as a challenge and also as a closing lecture. As you said, it expands the geographic scope, but I would also like to think of it as expanding the time zone. As you know, as you mentioned, your sense of time have moved from the 16th to the 18th and 19th into the 20th century. So I would like to bring in my study of the festival as part of a very contemporary urban history. In fact, my work on the Durga Pujas was the first time I actually really did a kind of ethnography of a contemporary urban festival. It was my first kind of truck with writing contemporary cultural history. So where, as a historian, I found my work was much more that of an ethnographer of the festival. But I do hope that the lecture today will be seen not just as a kind of added on case from another distant part of the world, which is Calcutta, once the capital of the British Empire, a huge post-colonial metropolitan city. But I do hope that there'll be common themes that have come up through the lectures, those of transience, temporality, the ephemeral object, of reuse, and of what we may think of as a particular space of festival production and spectatorship, which of course, in which the Renaissance festivals led the way. So I do hope that this will be seen not just as a case study from another part of the world, but will speak to some of the common concerns. I'd also like to thank friends and colleagues from across different parts of the world who are listening in today, and particularly to those in Calcutta who decided to stay up late to listen to the lecture. What I'm presenting today, as you rightly said, is out of the last chapter of my book, which ends with the phase of destruction. But it's also been adapted and changed to be part of a new volume, the editor of whom is attending this talk, called Religion and the City. So it is really out of that paper that I'm presenting this talk today. So I will begin by sharing the screen if I can, right? Okay. Okay, now let me go to slideshow. And okay. So everybody can see the screen, I presume. Okay, so as I said, the lecture focuses on the city of Kolkata in West Bengal, a state in Eastern India, and on its biggest autumnal cultural festival that centers on the annual homecoming of goddess Durga, who descends to earth each year on her ritually designated dates from a Himalayan abode with her 4 children in tow. Now, let me introduce you then to the goddess herself, and rather than read this out, I'll keep that up on the screen so that you have a sense of the specific iconography of the goddess in Bengal, how she combines her martial role with that of her mother and a daughter coming home with her 4 children from her mountain abode, and who's welcomed with great emotional kind of frenzy and then bid farewell with the same kinds of intensity. While the Durga Pujas are celebrated by Bengali communities across India's cities and states and across the world, the city of Kolkata is where the ritual occasion has, over the mid and late 20th century, and particularly in the early 20th century, taken on its full-blown form of a festival. I would say, in Jacob Burckhardt's wonderfully articulated sense of the term, giving the festivals a key place in the social and cultural life of the Renaissance, he reflected on the Italian festivals as maturing into, I quote, a higher phase in the life of the people, marking in their best form the point of transition from real life into the world of art. He also talked about the intermingling of different cultures and communities, different classes and communities, as being one of the markers where, from being an elite, it becomes a popular and public event. So it's in all those sense that I have approached the festival too, in a wholly different temporal, cultural, and geographic setting. It is the modern artistic life of this festival of the goddess that has also been my main point of entry into this field of study. I've been particularly interested in the deep, move on to the next one. So this is an example of the new kind of artistic forms that the goddess takes. The birds around her are given the form of contemporary art installations with a folk art aesthetic predominating much of the early work under this new wave. As I said, I've been particularly interested in the deep constitutive link between this favorite goddess of Bengal and the city of Calcutta, now Kolkata. It is a relationship of mutual concordance in which the history of the colonial city and the developing urban form of the festival morph into each other. The city is where we can best track the passage of this festival of the goddess from its extravagant celebrations in the homes of the merchant and landowning aristocracy of the late 18th and early 19th century to its later 20th century life as what in Bengali is referred to as a Sarbojonin Utsav. Utsav means festival, Sarbojonin means belonging to all, as a community festival for all, in the open spaces of the city, organized by local clubs and committees. So the early 20th century form is what really has grown hugely, exponentially in size and scale, and defines the face of the public festival today. This burgeoning history of the public community puja, in turn, offers an important way of mapping the geographical spread of the late colonial and post-colonial city with its dense spatial graph of older and newer neighborhoods. If this metropolis is given the Durga Puja's markedly urban and contemporary character, We could also see how the expanding contours of the festival and its installations have in many ways shaped the specific urbanity of Calcutta's streets and localities and the kinds of art installations they host. So I give an example to show how it is these narrowest of alleys that get transformed during this festival season. And so in a way, these alleys and narrow streets lend themselves to a particular urban aesthetic of the festival. The city is also where we witness the festival's proclivity to constantly outstrip the rites of worship and turn into an occasion for sociability and celebration, hedonism and revelry, public spectacle, and mass touring. So this is an example. There'll be lots of local details of clubs and awards which you can ignore. But this is an example of revelry and celebration at the receiving of an award. And this is an example of mass touring. Not least of all, Kolkata is where the present festival has taken on its grandest public scale, encompassing all spaces, streets, and neighborhoods. So it's not localized in any single part of the city at all. It really encompasses the entire metropolis and its outskirts, and of course, all parts of Bengal. Its rising profile, this is where we also see the full-blown nature of its commercial and corporate character, the awards, the commercial sponsorship, and its rising profile as a public art event involving a new creed of puja artists and designers. And it is in this contemporary avatar that the Durga Puja seeks to give the city its global cultural branding, its key cultural event to showcase to the rest of the country and the world. And I'd just like to put in that I've been involved in putting up a dossier on the Durga Pujas to be included under the UNESCO Intangible Heritage of Mankind list. And it is so, in a way, it's an attempt to place this festival within a larger global kind of heritage of festivals and gain that. So this is, in a way, the one event through which the city seeks its global cultural branding. Now, one of the distinct features of the festivals of Renaissance Europe, as is well known, was the passage from the ecclesiastical to the avowedly secular character, from the performance of piety to the showcasing of pomp and spectacle, pantomimes, and processions. Across time and culture, celebrations, pageants, and spectacles have historically been an inseparable feature of the public performance of religion. In studying these, it is often neither possible nor even analytically useful to separate out a liturgical domain of customs and practices from the broader ambience of festivities that have evolved within the same sphere. The Durga Pujas in particular have, over a very long history, lent itself most resonantly to the notion of a festival, an utsav, where the autumn season has been a time for congregation and conviviality, of the coming together of families, friends, communities, and neighborhoods, and of the close enmeshing of worship with mass public celebration. In recent times, these cultures of festivities in Kolkata have come to cohere more and more around an efflorescence of art and craft productions by artists and designers who made their name in this field of festival art. Around blitz of publicities and awards, and an unparalleled intensity of crowd touring, and of course, over the last couple of years in particular, of photography. So people actually photograph continuously. Here you see them with big cameras, now you only see them with cell phones. So people photograph now more than they even see. As the biggest show in town, the Durga Pujas has become also a spectacle of advertising and consumption, of fashions and releases, of products ranging from the older variety of literary annuals, music albums, clothes line, to new electronic gadgets like cell phones and tablets, to computers, and even to alcohol and liquor brands. Now, what's interesting here, therefore, is how the goddess lends her iconography, her 10 arms, as we see her, to everything from new cell phones and tablets, to even alcohol brands without the least sense of defilement. There is no other goddess among the country's growing pantheon who so openly tests the sanctity of worship within a festival. Yet it seems that while the disappearing religiosity of the public festival has been a matter of long-standing lament that, all worship has gone out of it, we find that the secular has proved to be an equally difficult denomination to attach to a celebration where Durga remains the central affective protagonist. And I've been reflecting on writing on this more since the book. So we find the secular as a difficult denomination, not only because Durga remains the central protagonist of the festival, but also where we find the term puja has remained an immovable fixture, referring sometimes to the organizing local club, sometimes to the entire festival, and only in passing to the ritual practices of worship from where the term has emerged. If the urban Durga Puja has always been inadequately religious, it has also remained incommensurately secular. The festival has, over the long period of its history, opened up a domain of social affect and transaction, where the normative institutional categories of the religious and the secular can neither fall comfortably in place nor be set off in opposition to each other. And as scholars in the field will agree that this is the case more broadly with the modern mutating characters of public festivals across the world from the Renaissance era into the present. Now, in the last chapter, or in the book, I'd also toyed with the idea of replacing the categories of the religious and secular with the categories of the sacred and the profane, following particularly Giorgio Agamben's work, the book called Profanations. And I looked at how far Agamben's notion of this liminal zone of use and exchange that he writes about, where, to quote him, the sacred and the profane represent two poles of a system in which a floating signifier travels from one domain to the other without ceasing to refer to the same object. Wherein the constant passage of meaning between the two, one must reckon with something like a residue of profanity in every consecrated thing and a remnant of sacredness in every profaned object. While the work of sacralization, Agamben argues, centers around keeping the spheres of humans and gods separate and distinct, that of profanation is about a refusal to hold on to these separations and to return that which was rendered sacred to the human sphere through contact, touch, play, use, and abandonment. While Agamben, however, believes, and this framework I found extremely useful to think about the festival and its move and how it refuses to separate the worlds of the human and divine, how it builds on this long tradition of the domestication and humanization of the goddess and making her one of us, one of friends and family. So while Agamben refers to a process of neutralization and deactivation of that which is profane, I would like to argue that what we see happening in this continuous intermingling of the sacred and the profane, of the human and the divine, is a form of reactivation of the affect and devotion that surrounds the goddess. And it is this that allows for her easy incorporation into changing middle-class desires and lifestyles of modern time with a playful mix of humor and irreverence. So on the heady occasion of the annual descent to earth of the goddess with her family, each act of what Agamben calls profaned by contagion becomes forms of creative appropriation and reanimation. Sorry, a minute. Okay, this is the one I wanted to show. Becomes forms of creative appropriation and reanimation, whereby Durga's effective powers as an icon is neither neutralized nor deactivated, but continually recharged in her promiscuous entanglements with the everyday worlds of human consumption and celebration. So she's shown with her elephant-headed son arriving on a newest motorbike, or you could see a woman in a beauty contest ad kind of transforming herself into the goddess herself. So when she looks at herself in the mirror, the face looks back at her as the clay face of the goddess. So there's a continuous intermingling of the human and the divine with the playful and the irreverent. Okay. Now, let me now come to the main part of the lecture, where I'll be exploring the specific connotations in a way of this notion of profanation within the festival, as it hurtles each year from the phase of production to that of destruction, into a cycle of consecration to that of obsolescence and waste. Now, this brings up, of course, the central theme of the seminar, which is the different connotations of time, transience, and cyclicality within the life of the festival. There is, for instance, the powerful interpolation all along of ritual and secular time in this seasonal cycle of festivity. The annual calendar of the festival and the main continuing format of Durga's household and public worship follows a strictly ritual calendar of dates and shows the embeddedness of the core ritual event, the continuing embeddedness within the civic urban festival of the present. What is a 5-day event also, we find, extends in different ways into the full year in Bengal. And I think that becomes one of the most interesting things to reflect about, which is the extended temporality of the seasonal event. We experience this in the way the spread of 12 months comes to be structured around the spread of 12 months comes to be structured around the single event into a time, and time gets blocked away into the before and after of the central event. In the way all work and professional time in the modern metropolis freezes during the week of the pujas, and not least of all in the way the schedule of planning and preparations of the vast commercial and creative economy that has grown around the festival runs through the entire year. And I showed this slide to show how these puja clubs have taken to looking at the festival as a round-the-year enterprise, where they announce the next year's puja with a cultural festival, even as one year's festival ends. In this talk, though, I'll be thinking about the extended temporality of the seasonal event, not through these registers of time, but primarily through the ways in which the material remnants of the festival remain thickly embedded through the year within the lived fabric of the city. The focus is on the theme of impermanence and transience that is germane to the phenomenon of festivals and festival productions across time and place. With no major Durga temples in existence in Calcutta or in all of Bengal, there are a few, but no major ones. The worship of the goddess has always been tied to a transitory cycle of a yearly arrival and departure, and premised on the fabrication of clay images to be immersed in the river at the end of the pujas. So this is the kind of the fabrication of the images, in the workshops. One prime workshop, but workshops across the city where they're made. And this is, of course, the immersion and her return to the waters and to alluvial clay. We see the same with the creation of elaborately constructed dismountable pavilions on open grounds, largely with bamboo. And there's a lot to be said about the kind of ephemeral art of architecture, of vernacular architecture that the puja has taken to a very fine art. And at the same time, these are made to be dismounted. They're made by decorator firms, often by artist groups too, but they're made in the end, a craft village we see here being routinely dismantled at the end of the festival week. The immense time, labor, capital, and creative energy that are invested in the creation of the goddesses' images and the earthly abodes called pandals stand contrasted by the routine forms of these dispersals. The effect of the aesthetic in this public sphere lies in the very brevity of its interventions, in the fleeting evanescent marks it leaves on objects, spaces, and the sensorial. Everything must be savored and absorbed in the short time span of the week of the festival. The continuum lies in the layering of memories and photographic images across the seasons, and the cyclical nature of the festival, where the end of one year's puja brings the awaiting and preparation for the next. From the frenzies of making that dramatically transform the face of the city over the months building up to the pujas, on which I've written about, and actually that is the phase to which everybody turns to. The moment the festival ends, everybody's back is turned on it too. I decided to look more closely at the many forms of unmaking that leave their equal imprint on the urban landscape. The logic of the ephemeral has generated a particular festival economy of waste and recycling that now gets tied to a year-round cycle of festivities, propelling large movements of labor and material within and beyond the city. To what extent can the cycle of destruction be thought of as profanations or deactivation of the once consecrated? What kinds of remnants of the sacred lie hidden in the post-festival landscapes of debris and fragments and idle refuse? How do we engage with the vast residue of objects, skills, and aspirations that the festival disgorges each year, which linger within the everyday fabric of the city? So these are the main concerns of this talk. Processes of discarding here involve different notions of waste, different economies of return and reuse. In the one case, as with the clay images of deities, the process is about the physical disintegration of objects that have finite lifespans and easily revert to becoming raw material and refuse. The decaying remains of idols that lie strewn across the city through the year carries signs of the hierarchies between different gods and goddesses and their calendars of worship. Separating out figures of subaltern goddesses like one of the ones we see here, Shitala, who are never immersed in water but left standing on pavements and watersides for their heads and bodies to slowly fall apart. This separates them from the destiny of major goddesses like Durga, Kali, or Jagadhatri. Their worships follow that of Durga, which are given grand ceremonial send-offs before they're cast into the river, with this elaborate dance with a clay torch, burning clay torch. Now, imbued with the symbolism of the cycle of nature and life, the bodies of the gods, like human ashes, are returned to the elements, most suspiciously to the river, from whose bed comes the clay to scud them anew. Hence the emphasis in traditional idol making on the use of biodegradable material, a straw stuffed mold layered with alluvial clay in the making of these images, and on the removal from the immersed deities of all that is non-dissolvable and recyclable, such as these wooden frames, clothes, weapons, or ornaments from the river waters. Hence also the dilemma of today's new genre of art Durgas made of durable material like wood, stone, or fiberglass that are in search of a continued existence as works of sculpture and cannot be reduced to idle refuse. And it is with these that I return to at the end, that it is they who are looking for a life of permanence and preservation. In the other case, as with the dispersal of the pavilions and their embellishments, the process of falling to waste is multi-layered. It involves varying ways in which the objects, while remaining whole, outlive the prime function for which they were made or become saleable or usable in other contexts. Afterlives here may entail the reduction of pandal architecture to reusable bamboo paths, ply paths like we see on the upper slide. Their transportation in part or in whole as portable tableaus to other festivals in other suburban towns, and their piecemeal reinstallation in other sites. Or as we see their decorative components now dispersed and lying on these festival grounds looking for buyers, as we see with these little Durgas made of baskets. The post-festival destinies of Durga Puja productions then take them into different categories of what we may call waste, that which we may call ritual garbage, that has been the subject of the cultural archaeology and anthropology of religious practices across the world, or that which comes under the rubric of industrial and consumer junk, around which has grown a large repertoire of contemporary art practices and another kind of anthropology of modern trash. In recent times, contemporary Indian artists across the local and national spectrum has turned to a variety of urban consumer waste to create bricolage of sculptures, mini cityscapes, and kinds of installations. And very well-known artists like Vivan Sundaram, for instance, have even created junky fashion wear and cityscapes in a set of installations called Gaga Waka and Trash. But I show you the work here of one relatively lesser known artist made with rubber tires, which held its place in the Indian Museum courtyard. Like their peers in the world of contemporary art, the city's Durga Puja designers have also made artistic capital out of cheap throwaway objects and material, ranging from earthen cups to sugarcane fibers to plastic bottles and toys, and also to heavy industrial waste. The main difference lies in that these festival creations thereafter fulfill the rights of authorship, even of the artists who made them, and themselves return to the state of disposable trash, which doesn't happen in the same way with the works of other artists. Now I come to the section called From Worshipped Image to Idol Refuse. So it will now move in three short parts where I look at the fate of the image, the worshipped image, the fate of the pandal installation, and finally on what happens to the desires to become art. Now, as the festival enters its last day, Vijayadashami, the goddess and her entourage are the first to leave. The greatest fanfare surrounds the ritual of her departure and her final journey to the riverbank. The day is centrally associated with the practices of what is called Visharjan and Bhashan. The first term filled with the solemnity of renouncement that is associated with the act of immersion and letting go of the deity. The second colloquial term carrying the more vivid invocations of the act of floating in water. So here is the immersion process happening, and this image has already been shown. The epitomic image of the occasion remains that of the goddess's upturned face and clenched fist gently bobbing above water, surrounded by fragments of her ornaments and weapons. What allows for the sharp volte-face of the worshipped idol from a living entity to discarded matter? At which point of time after the end of the Dashami rituals is life believed to leave the sculpted body of the deities, rendering them into inanimate objects to be abandoned or immersed? And there are lots of kind of theological also debates on which is the moment in which life leaves the deity. Is it when the priest chants his last incantation, even shaking the frame, allowing the gods to depart from their temporary bodies? Or is it when in traditional households, you place a mirror at the foot of the goddess and a pot of Ganga water is poured over the reflected image in the water as a symbolic immersion? The affective engagement with the living goddess lingers and deepens through the intimate moments when married women collectively bid farewell with three items: sindoor, which is what married women wear on their forehead, and betel leaf and sweets, often climbing precarious ladders to reach the height of Durga's face. And it reaches its pitch during the boisterous beats of the drum and the dancing, when the images, their face doused with red, mouth stuffed with sweets, and their decorations coming undone, are carried out of the altars and placed on illuminated trucks to make their rounds of the neighborhood before they head for the riverbank. The pathos of the last day is infectious. As the evening proceeds, the eyes of the deity seems to be well up with tears, and a quiet melancholy sinks in with her leaving. Paradoxically, it is in the last phase of the most intense humanization of the goddess, when we do believe that she's crying and that she's about to leave, that our attachment with her must finally be severed. This is best achieved in the crowded and raucous and impersonal milieu of the river banks, where the goddess is given over to idol bearers and civic workers in the larger ones to be seen through to the end. In the smaller ones, the family members themselves do the immersion. It is in these big main river banks of Kolkata that have been designated for immersions that earlier practices of consigning the goddess to the river are now contending with new environmental narratives of saving the river and the city's water bodies from the pollution of idle waste. And it is in these banks that one witnesses a new brutality of destruction of the deity that rudely overhauls the traditional poetics of immersion. From 2011, the Kolkata Port Trust began to deploy giant cranes and barges at the central idol immersion site within the city. This is at a place called the Baje Kadamtala Ghat, adjoining Babu Ghat and Judges Ghat, on the main stretch of the city's riverfront along the Strand. These river banks are stated to witness as many as 1,500 immersions over 2 to 3 nights, often one every 5 minutes during the peak hours of the evening. As the largest Durga ensembles arrive here, these enormous images are offloaded from the trucks, stripped of flowers and other accessories that are deposited in large garbage vats, circled around in their wooden frames. This is what we see happening here, to hoarse cries of victory to the goddess and the invocation of her return next year before they're lowered into the muddy banks and pushed to the edge of the water. Now, the images are given only a token submersion in the river, but are no longer allowed to float away. Contained within a roped enclosure, the job of the crane is to immediately scoop up and dump these idol corpses on the barges of the embankment, as flaying limbs and torsos drop from above, and detached heads popped out of mangled bodies of straw and clay. All feelings are numbed by the intensity of labor and exhaustion. Within minutes of moving into the water, the goddess's destruction is complete, and her remains thrown into a mass of disintegrated idol parts that are heaped on the water banks of all immersion sites, from where in the coming days, various items like wooden frames, face molds, or sections of clothes and ornaments will be scavenged and recycled by an informal economy of those who pick on these and resell them. These informal recycling practices are now increasingly regulated and contained within this organized municipal drive of clearing the river of immersion refuse. So we have the High Court actually employing civic agencies for removing idol refuse from the Hooghly within 36 hours or 48 hours of the immersion. And the West Bengal Pollution Control Board statutory guidelines for the immersion now falling into place. So in a way, there are more and more strictures now on idol immersion. And there are also now smaller designated sites for immersion to take the pressure off the main ghat, and where the clearing of idol refuse now takes on a major kind of role along with what happens in the main river. And you also have designated new areas with these tableaus called Devi Ghat, where these immersions take place. So in keeping with other aspects of the festival, a new environmental friendly system of immersion and river clearance has now emerged as a new area of urban governance, determining a speedy laying to waste of the goddess. Now, when we come to vandals, the sale and travel, none of this kind of institutional coordination is at hand for the clearing of the city's equally vast output of spectacular pavilions. Constructed with elaborate material design and artistry, the lives of these architectural structures are as short-lived as the festival. nonchalantly turns its back on creations that had enamored streams of viewers the week before. The processes of dispersal here are slower, mundane, and emptied of public attention, unlike the immersion of the deity. They also unfold in piecemeal phases, engaging a network of puja organizers, pandal decorators, designers, and artists, with only the occasional entry of government or corporate bodies in acquiring a few samples of festival art. Over the past decades, pandals have turned into ambitious varieties of art and craft installations without any parallel infrastructure emerging for their preservation or reuse, without any systematic planning by clubs, designers, or civic authorities on the future of their productions. Their dissembling occurs through as complex a mobilization of labor and movement of objects that went into their making, as they travel from one festival site to another, from Calcutta into different district towns, and the other pujas of goddess Kali and Guha-Thakurta that follow within a month of the Durga Pujas. With no strict demarcation of their ritual lives like that of the goddess, the afterlives of these pandal structures are premised on these loose spills and spreads, on their propensity to disaggregate and reappear in different times and spaces. Now, to quickly take you through this, so in some sense, the ritual calendar itself determines sometimes the layover of the pandals in open space. So the goddess Lakshmi, one of the daughters of Durga, is worshipped usually in the same pandal space. So normally they keep a small structure still going for a week afterwards, where this goddess, but you can see how she stands alone and forlorn in the premises with no crowds anymore coming to visit her. Now, usually the main street is cleared and only the central core of a pandal is retained for this low-key subdued event, the post-festival pall evident in the small forlorn figure of the goddess standing alone in these empty public sites. In most cases, the full pavilions with all their decor are left standing intact by the clubs till awaiting buyers or waiting to be dismantled and transported in an already contracted sale to a suburban puja committee. In what follows, I look at these pandals which are there now up for sale, and they're there almost a week after the festival, waiting for decorator firms or puja organizers in suburban cities to come and carve these away and reuse them in other festivals. If the sales of this the fate of majority of today's grand puja pavilions is to be shunted from metropolitan ambience of Kolkata's Durga Pujas to the suburban milieu of Kali Pujas and Jagadhatri Pujas, where they're frequently shorn down, readapted to new spaces, and placed around sizes and styles of locally made images with which often they have no aesthetic concordance. Like the pavilions, the idea of a theme puja often travels indiscriminately and in fragments as a transplantable form, emptied of authorship and original conception. So these are more pandal structures that remain standing, waiting for reuse. And these are two examples I show you of Durga Puja pandals which get readapted for use in the Kali Puja in these suburban towns. So there's a whole new study to be done about the economy of the suburban economy of festivals and the way these, just like a lot of labor and material travel from outside Calcutta to the city, similarly, these travel from the city to these other suburban towns. This is the Kali Puja pandal, and this is in the town of Chandarnagar, an old French settlement, where the bulk of the puja productions often move. So in a way, if we think of all the raw material, labor, and organization of the pandal making trade comes from the suburban hinterland into the city, the travels of these built structures back into the suburbs opens up, in a way, a kind of reciprocity of flows. So this is where I look at pandal reuse, where the ownership of the pandals passes in all cases to the puja committees who paid for them, and professional decorators who constructed them. And they are the ones who actively broker these sales and transfers, with their main interest in clearing public spaces just after the pujas. And most frequently sidelined in all this are the artists who design these pavilions, who surrender not only their authorship of the works, but also their share in the sales and the manner of their reuse. In this recycling economy, only a few designers have over time begun to exercise new kinds of rights over their productions and their reinstallation. These designers bring in their own workforce, their own material, retain ownership over their Durga Puja production, and themselves organize their packing, transportation, and setting up in other town festivals through fresh commissions they acquire from these puja clubs. So this is one such example, and this is an example of one such puja designer who made these with folding cardboard puppets, which is now being carefully packed to be transported for use in a Kali Puja or in a Jagat-Dhatri Puja. To be able to recycle one's Durga Puja productions in Kolkata between a Kali Puja in another city and a Jagat-Dhatri Puja or two in Chandanagar, which is the main hub of this festival, is to have recovered the full cost of original production with a generous margin of profit, and also a way in which the designer can spread his fame from Kolkata elsewhere. But more and more cases, the designer has no say over it. And it is really, they're just taken over. So what happens at the end is a lot of folk art, a lot of craft objects such as this. We see a Madhubani artist at work. These objects are all then come up for sale. There's a euphemism called auctions, actually. They just come and they're looking for a quick disposal for whoever will come and buy and pick this up. Very few puja organizers and artists have the right network of contacts or the resources to find a prominent home for their productions in hotels and office grounds or in open air galleries. Whereas the older practices for idol and pandal making have the logic of destruction and recycling of material built into the nature of these trades, the new genres of Durga Puja art struggle to come to terms with their ephemeral public lives and their post-festival redundancy as collectible artworks. The problem, I would argue, lies in the very dispensations of art that has come to rest within this festival of production, display, and spectatorship. In profiling the contemporary Durga Pujas as Kolkata's biggest public art event, one of the main aims that are in my book was to lay open the claims of art in this festival as both a set of insisting projections, but also a mesh of incomplete formations. The importance of holding on to one's identity as artist in this creative domain escalates precisely in proportions to the difficulties of doing so. Even as the festival has nurtured a new thriving vocation of art and design, as we've seen, the designation of art or designer and the authority and acclaim that they generate is never a secure index in this domain. All transitions in this sphere remain incomplete. Thus, each puja production, however ambitious, is left with no other name in local parlance but a pandal to be dismantled. In the same way in which each designer image, however innovative its iconography, is left grappling to transcend its status as an idol and become a work of art. The term Thakur, meaning deity, is one that continuously clears the ground on which the religious festival contends with its life as a spectacular exhibitionary event. Let us also consider now how this term Thakur also enters an aborted attempt to create a museum of Durga Puja art in recent times, where a converted warehouse tucked away deep within the grounds of the rejuvenated Dhakuria lakes of the city, now called the Rabindra Sarovar, was converted into a kind of museum where came a selection of artworks from Puja Pandals and art Durgas of the seasons of 2012 and 13. So we see here some of it, and we see here some of the images that were put up there. But what is interesting is the way the locals of the area referred to this gallery with wonder and bemusement as the Thakurta gallery, the gallery of the gods. The appellation said it all. It spoke to the curious status of these images as not quite worshipped idols and not quite modern art. It also drove home the ambivalence of such a venture of turning goddesses into art objects, of transferring them from a festival venue with its established spectatorship into an isolated gallery venue with no defined public, nor any professional team of curators and designers to conceive of a new framework for their viewing. The award-winning renown and art status of these objects within the festival was clearly no guarantee of their new life as works of sculpture in a gallery that was initially set up for contemporary art. Compounding this problem was the complete lack of prior planning, professional curatorial expertise, and the involvement of the art community in the forming in 2012 of what may be seen as the city's first museum of collectible Durga Puja art. It is not surprising, therefore, that this Thakurta gallery, or the Gallery of Goddesses, proved to be a stillborn venture, sliding into obscurity soon after it came into being in November 2012. Few in the city's art circuits know or have cared to know about its existence and future, and even fewer have visited it. Unlike the festival setting from where these goddesses came, these images are now available for close artistic scrutiny and leisurely viewing, but with barely anyone to do so. Even as they were collected, a cloud of uncertainty and unresolved question hung over these exhibits. When the gallery is given over to new exhibitions of the season's festival art, what will happen to these objects, most of which have nowhere to return to? How feasible is in the long run is the idea of such a permanent museum, given how little from each season's festival can be collected and the limited time for which they can be preserved? These questions actually were not really engaged with. 2 years later, with no maintenance and hardly any visitors, the museum already lay in shambles, its open-air displays broken and lying in disarray. So we look at some of this. This was a giant Buddha head which was installed, which we see flattened on the ground. And this is part of a large section of an installation, a foot, which is lying as part of the kind of lack of care of this, whatever was installed. There is no escaping, it seems, from the falling to waste of festival art objects, even in a location like the Warehouse Gallery, where they were assembled for preservation. The gallery grounds came to be reduced within 2 years to the same landscape of festival leftovers that one encounters throughout the city. Its scattered fragments of assembled puja art sharing the same fate as the two headless, naked idol corpses of a Krishna and Radha that stood outside the complex of the lakes. Ephemerality remains the quintessence of the phenomenon that swivels around the give and take between spectacle and ruin, between the interchangeable and the specific, between profit and waste, the sacred and the profane, the whole and the fragment. In ending this essay, I know I've run out of time, I'd like to return to the theme of profanations to ask whether the notion of desacralization in the sphere belongs less to the disused religious object and more to the abandoned artifacts that carry the fledgling ambitions of being artworks. That which was worshipped has its natural returns to vegetation and waste. Durga's mortal passage each year from a vast repertoire of beautifully modeled and animated images to heaps of idle refuse does nothing to deactivate her divinity and the emotional verve of adoration. Rather, what stand profaned are the forsaken goddesses in the gallery, which have well outlived their value, both religious and artistic, and have nowhere to go. there's a different niggling sense of violation in the falling to ruin and the inability to be preserved of pavilions and tableaus that are made as works of public art, in which I invested as large a dose of artistic aspiration as well as material and labor. Every season, I have imagined futures for Durga Puja pavilions that were never to be. For instance, this spectacular radial sun made by bamboo poles on a cemented earth form made by artist Guha-Thakurta. Or similarly, another work, this rotunda pavilion with the 10 arms of the goddesses enclosing a buffalo head. He's one of the most talented artists in this setting. Could have found new life as public art in several open spaces of the city. The superb Pakistani truck art installation at the Hathibagan Puja of 2013 that came out of a novel Indo-Pakistani cultural cooperation scheme brought in 3 Pakistani truck painters to work on site and involved a huge budget. Could also have been picked up by an enterprising hotelier and used as public art in the city. But none of this happens. And so my wishes for these, like those of the artist, keeps growing wings, even if they seldom take off. Yet there's no denying that while there's actually no preservation and collecting of much of this installation art, there are different ways in which ideas, skills, and materials thrown up by the Durga Pujas are continuously being put to new use in the city, especially by a government which is now besotted with its own schemes of beautification of the city. The motifs and material of Durga Puja continue to thickly envelop the public spaces in ways that both confound and amuse. Who would have thought that the goddess's 3-pronged spear, the trishul with which she pierces the demon, would give its form to rows of present-day street lighting, or that the 12 tons of scrap iron metal that an artist had used for one of his experimental installations at a puja site would be sold off to a local municipal councillor who would use it to make a mini replica of the city's famous Howrah Bridge, constructed across a now beautified water body at the place where my office is, Tapati. As an unsuspected reincarnation of a Durga Puja pavilion, this miniature bridge also finds itself flanked by a sculpted immersion tableau of the goddess being carried into the river. Even if the works of Puja artists seldom find the forms of post-festival collecting and the preservation they seek, there is today a different flow of the remains of their work into the popular public art of the city. There's clearly no dearth of demand for the trades of sculpting and pavilion making in the city, where the role of festivals felicitating the human and the divine never stop. In a different essay, I've looked at the way a current regime of populist politics in Bengal has centrally grounded itself on a never-ending circuit of festivities, where the master event of the Durga Pujas lends its format to each of these events, generating through the agency of the local clubs a year-round proliferation of street decor, public statuary, and architectural replicas. Like Calcutta has its own Big Ben, and Calcutta has its 7 Wonders of the World park, where Durga Puja artists like the one we see here now takes to making architectural replicas as theme parks. There's a blurring here of the distinction that has been invoked between the concentrated and diffuse forms of the spectacle, where the former is associated with the festival as a political and aesthetic form that has a long history from the French Revolution to fascism, which is the concentrated form, while the diffuse form of the spectacle is seen to belong to the everyday worlds of pleasure, consumption, and commodity culture. In contemporary Kolkata's never-ending cycle of festivities, each one leading to the other, their effects flow from their concentration in time and place to their suffusion of all spaces and time. This results not just in the festivalization of everyday life, but also the dissolving of all boundaries between modes of festivities modes of leisure and consumption, and also modes of governance. This is why it has become non-stop puja and festival time in the current regime of Bengal, till, of course, the pandemic struck, with the categories of puja and utsav seamlessly flowing into each other. The distinction between work time and festival time that was set in place all over the modern world, especially in colonial India, as an essential feature of a modern urbanized society and government, stands unabashedly overturned, not by an undisciplined populace or by pre-modern peripheral communities, but in this case by the government and by the modern institutions of set designing and art installations. I'll end here because I think I've really overshot my time hugely. So thank you all for your patience.